Hi everybody, Tri-Areas Wargaming here. I just have a quick break from doing some work this Sunday, so I wanted to give you guys a quick look at a rule set I picked up. Well, expansion to a rule set I picked up. Lion Rampant, the Crusader States, and I'm going to do a quick review of this kind of expansion set. So this is not going to be a review of like the Lion Rampant rules themselves. They're a pretty popular rule set for kind of more skirmish style wargaming. I came out quite a few years ago now, I think, very popular. But this just came out, I think, either in 2020 or 2019, the kind of Crusader States expansion. And yeah, this was actually produced by the University of University of Edinburgh. So, you imagine this is going to be a quite well-researched book, and we'll take a look at it. But yeah, the Crusades, I think, are one of the most interesting periods in history. They're extensive, pretty extensively war-gamed. And, so I wanted to take a look at this. And I think they're also, as well as being very popular, one of the most misunderstood periods in history as well, especially in the kind of popular view of things, very misunderstood. And, the Crusades have been, a way for people to make hay, depending on what their, orientations are, political orientations. And really the actual reality of the Crusades has basically nothing to do with any modern situations or wars or political events. The Crusades are really very much removed from that. They've been interpreted kind of in strange ways. Well, not strange necessarily, but, interpreted in different ways in the last 100 years. But the reality is, those events have very little bearing on modern events, shall we say. Anyways, let's get into these rules. So here we are with the rule book itself. Now, Lion Rampant is not really a tournament rule set. It's more of a kind of fun, casual play type deal. So this book is very much in line with that. This book is definitely, more for, a scenario guide, for selection guide, not really a set of kind of hardcore tournament rules. And in this set, I'm, reviewing this, I'm not going to show you too much of this book because I don't want to, cheat the publishers here, but I do want to kind of show you what we have here. So we start out, we got, from page 4 till 17, a brief history, which, is worthwhile because most people don't really understand what the history of the Crusades actually was, what actually happened. I think it's worthwhile having that in there. For me, I've read a lot about this period. I actually haven't really looked at this yet because I kind of know what's going on. So then for rules, you got some additional rules, that add to that kind of Crusades era flavor. These items I'll do a little run through, flick through of the book so you can see what's in here. But you got things like Greek fire, talismanic objects. If, you're familiar with the Crusades, you've got like the Holy Lance that, Peter the Hermit or whatever dug up in Antioch, and the shard of the true cross. And they have more other objects in here too. Holy and unholy characters, I think probably Peter the Hermit would probably fit into that kind of thing. And, these kind of religious fervor, fear, rules, stuff like that. Army lists. Now, here's another real strong point of this book is a lot of the times I see people, when they're talking about the Crusades, they kind of lay out two factions. You got the Crusaders, the Franks, versus the quote unquote here, Saracens. This book really unpacks the different factions that there were. Western Crusaders, those are things like the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Western armies that traveled to the Holy Land just for the campaign. You have the Italian Maritime Republics. They were doing all kinds of stuff over in the Holy Land. They're especially noted for their siege work abilities and crossbowmen. Frankish settlers, these are some of the most under-discussed, I think, in popular imagination. The First Crusade established Crusader kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and so and so. And these people, settled to stay. Most, when the First Crusade, the people who survived, most of them died. And it was, the First Crusade was like Stalingrad level horror, cannibalism from starvation, etc. Most of those people, as soon as they captured Jerusalem and they defeated another Fatimid army, they were like, we're going home. We're done with this. We did our job. But others, stayed to settle. And they also tried to attract settlers. About 10% of the population of the Holy Land was Frankish, settlers who came in. And, they were the ones really holding the line, keeping those kingdoms running. Your military orders like the Templars, everyone's kind of familiar with that. Pilgrims, marauders, those are like bandits. So the Muslim principalities of Syria and Anatolia, those are like the city-states of like Damascus, for example, is, one of the big ones, Damascus. Those are, the Middle East was actually really fragmented at the time of the First Crusade. And they were the kind of these independent city-states, and most of the troops, actually, the good troops in those were Turkish, whether they were, wild Turks, Turkomans, hot off, the Central Asian steppes, or the Asgar, who were like the settled peoples. Fatimid Egypt is really interesting. They were actually more of a mix of, it was entirely mercenaries in that army, mainly actually Christians and slave soldiers. From sub-Saharan Africa, like Nubian slave soldiers, and then Armenian Christian cavalry, etc. Saladin, he's kind of starts the Ayyubid dynasty, or makes it powerful anyways. He was, a Kurd born in Damascus to Ayyub, who was his dad, and he kind of, brings all those principalities together, and he's kind of like, his army really reflected that. Just he had much more resources, and he also, he brought in siege engineers and things. Mamluks were the slave soldiers of the Ayyubids who eventually rebel. Baybars is kind of the big one. He's not often talked about, I feel like, enough, but Baybars was like, a big deal, and he defeated the Mongols. The Mongols are coming in kind of later in this period, and Nur al-Din, he was one of these Muslim principality guys. Nur al-Din, he was a Turkic warlord. Again, he won the Battle of the Acre Sanguinis, the Field of Blood. He's not often talked about enough, I think. Saladin is always talked about. You don't hear about Nur al-Din as much. You don't hear about Baybars as much. Mongols, no real introduction needed for them. You also have the Ilkhanate. It's a big enemy of the Mamluks. In kind of modern-day Iran, Mongols controlling Iran kind of deal. Byzantines, you probably heard of them. They were actually very active in this period as well. Armenians, another people who's totally kind of left out of the the story often. The Armenians. There are also many Armenian knights in the crusading forces. The Armenians were a Christian kingdom kind of trying to hold on. And a lot of Armenians intermarried with the Crusaders and fought in the army as well. And this is what I think really shines with this book, is the scenarios. So let's kind of take a flick through now. I've kind of been running my mouth chatting. You got some nice pictures for color in here. A nice map, kind of showing what was going on. You see here's, the Armenians, the Seljuk Turks, the Sultanate of Rum, or Rome, was kind of established after Manzikert, Turks moving in. Pictures, I think, from the Osprey series, and then, most of the ones they show in here are Gripping Beast. These pictures are useful as well, I think, for modeling. I like to have these in here. This one you can see, a mix of equipment in there. Some of these pictures, too, a lot of the times we think of these surcoats as being totally dominant in, the 12th and 13th centuries. Other, period pictures show people without surcoats, and still wearing conical helms and stuff. And this is cool, this guy's like a bishop at arms, it looks like. You got your army list, so very simple. You know, most of the troop types are drawn from the Lion Rampant main book, like your mounted men-at-arms and sergeants and whatever. And then I think, you know, you've got upgrades that, you know, that are unique to those troop types. And again, this is more, you know, the goal for this is not balance, I think, in this rule set. It's more for, you know, more for getting you the right troop types to portray the, you know, the factions. Yeah, the Italian Maritime Republics, again, you know, they do an interesting job kind of differentiating these, like, you know, like Genoese crossbowmen. This is a faction that is, you know, built around crossbowmen. You know, you got special characteristics for these different factions too. And I'm going to be talking more about this Crusader stuff as I build my Crusader armies. The goal right now for me is I'm going to build a First Crusade, an early Crusader era army, and then also a, you know, I think I'm going to go with a Turkic warband. You know, the Fatimids I think are really interesting, but you know, I don't think I'm going to get onto those until next year, but maybe I might do them instead. I'm still not quite sure. But yeah, they're pretty interesting in that they almost entirely relied on mercenaries, and they were eventually, you know, the Crusaders defeated them in pitched battles quite often, and then Saladin eventually like takes them over basically, and Egypt becomes the power base of the Ayyubid Empire and then the Mamluk Empire. And that's why, you know, you'll see a lot of the later Crusades are targeted at Egypt, because that is, you know, where the money comes from. That's the power base. And very few, you know, the Egyptian population itself had been demilitarized by this point. So, you know, the Fatimids, they couldn't get Turkic mercenaries because they were kind of cut off from, you know, where the Turks come from. So they, you know, got sub-Saharan Africans, they got Armenians into the army. And these soldiers were motivated for pay, but they weren't really motivated by any kind of ideology or real loyalty to the cause. And that they reflect this in this rule set. You know, the Fatimids, you know, you get more troops, but they have less, you know, courage stat than, you know, their equivalents, which is pretty interesting. And it's cool that, you know, that they portrayed this faction accurately. You know, Saladin and the Ayyubids and Mamluks, they'll get Turks to be the bulk of their army, and those were, you know, the really good troops. You know, you know, they were motivated for plunder too, but they were, you know, pretty solid troops. I love, you know, Byzantine artwork like this. It'd be cool to see, you know, a range of miniatures that look like this. I haven't really seen one that kind of has that look. Armenians, yeah, they seem to get no mention a lot of the times in popular histories, but they were really important. I think you could model them kind of similar to Byzantines. I know the Paris have a couple packs of them, but they're, you know, a lot of what we assume are Frankish knights. You know, there was a lot more diversity to the Crusader armies than we usually think. And I'm going to talk more about that later because I'm rambling here. So scenarios, this is where this book really shines, I think. And some of these I really want to do as soon as I can get the troops assembled for them. So this one, the Siege of Antioch and the 25 Genoese martyrs. You know, what's interesting about this scenario is this one is, you know, the Genoese are going to die in the scenario. It's a question of, you know, how long they hold out. You know, how fast can the Turks kill them? And all these, you know, scenarios are drawn from actual history too, which I think is really cool. You know, you don't get those kind of generic scenario. What is great about this is you don't get those generic scenarios that you so often see that aren't really rooted in history. These are all drawn directly from primary sources, which is so cool. Raiding, there are a bunch of raiding scenarios, which is a big feature of this, and that was a huge feature of Crusading warfare. One thing, you know, we always think of these big battles, you know, the Ager Sanguinis, Field of Blood, or Hattin, or Ramallah, or whatever. the big decisive battles. Most of the warfare was skirmishing, raiding, because those big battles were risky. The Crusaders knew that, especially fighting Turks, the Fatimids and the Crusaders were conventional forces. They weren't as afraid of the battles. Fighting the Turks, you're fighting an unconventional enemy in many ways. And, the thing is, if the Crusaders' armies were destroyed, such as in the case of Ager Sanguinus or Hattin, then, that was kind of spelled the end of that kingdom, essentially. Or it was a disaster. Those battles were absolutely disastrous if things went wrong. So most of it was raiding, and it was, the Islamic factions were raiding each other as well. Like this one, I think, I guess it must be the raiding the neighbors. This was a really interesting one, I thought. Yeah, raiding the neighbors. Directly taken from history. It's features on this island, kind of capturing raiders who are in your territory. And people forget too, the Islamic factions didn't exactly like each other, these principalities. Oftentimes they would ally with the Crusaders too if it fit them. The Mamluks and the Mongols both, the Mongols aren't really Islamic, but the Mongols and the Mamluks were both trying to get the, remaining Crusader rump states to be allies, and the Crusaders were trying to kind of stay out of it. And eventually the Mamluks, though, would, defeat the Mongols and the Crusaders. Again, escape from Hattin, fleeing the disaster. Oh, here you go. Here's a, one of those things I was talking about, a 13th century illuminated manuscript. You can see there the troops are not wearing surcoats. They look in many ways very similar to 11th century knights. So that's one cool thing about this period is you can continue to use like your 11th century Normans into the 13th century. I don't think you have to feel pressured to super modernize them. Although this manuscript, I don't know where this was made, but one thing when you're modeling your troops, don't be afraid as well to use Arabized headgear for Crusaders and stuff, because they actually really intermarried with, the local populations, and I'll talk about that in later videos. But there you have it. I think if you're interested in the Crusades and you like Lion Rampant, you could do worse than picking this up. The one scenario I would actually like to see, and this is probably, better suited to a large battle rule set, but is a march, a contested march. That is one thing you see a lot in the Crusades is, the Crusaders, a lot of the time, so the armies that were opposing them, like the army of Saladin, a lot of the Turks, the Turkomans, especially the Wild Turks, they were in it for the plunder, and they didn't want to be in the field for a long time unless, they were getting their plunder. But the Crusaders would kind of do a doing a march in full battle gear to kind of deny territory. And the goal was kind of to get to their destination and survive. And kind of resist these attacks. That would be kind of a cool scenario to see in there. Richard the Lionheart did a really famous one of these marches where the army, is marching in column, but marching for war, and literally the guys in the back of the column, and the sources say this directly, would be walking backwards to resist attack. Another thing, I haven't even played Lion Rampant before. I got the main Lion Rampant book as well. And I think there's this wild charge rule that may reflect this, but the Crusading Knights always faced this problem when they were getting attacked is to be successful, they had the tools to win, but they needed to launch their battle-winning charge at exactly the right time. And, sometimes, the Frankish settlers got really good at judging when to launch this attack, but they also had their, pride to worry about. And the Turks would try and needle them into attacking before, the time was right. And, that was kind of their strategy, is to make sure the charge was really ragged of the Crusaders. And, it was a affront to the Crusaders' honor it was a challenge to their honor to be attacked and shot at and not charge. And, the other factor with this is the horses. And, just like in modern desert warfare, without vehicles, on a flat plain, infantry on foot are dead meat facing, mobile infantry and vehicles or whatever. The same was with the horses. The Crusaders needed the horses to fight the Turks. And a lot of the times when they were being bombarded with archery, the horses would be dying. So, the Crusaders needed to launch their counterattack before all their mounts were destroyed. And equally, you see the Crusaders using a lot of crossbows, densely packed crossbowmen and bowmen in the shield wall to, shoot the Turks' horses, who, horses were the most valuable thing many of the Turkic warriors owned. So they didn't want to have their horses killed either. So you'd have kind of a standoff as well. So it'd be interesting to see that reflected in this book. And I haven't, played it and seen it enough to see if that kind of thing occurs, especially with this wild charge rule. But anyways, I've been rambling enough. If you're interested in the Crusades, the skirmish warfare in the Crusades, which is something I'm interested in, as I also build up my large armies as well for, big battle stuff, you could definitely do worse than checking this out. And I'm always looking for resources as well. And I love the scenarios in here. And it's useful, too, to have a force selection guide, whereas I have a good idea of what, those armies were composed of. But it's nice to see someone else's opinion, too, and to work off that and, have your ideas confirmed or unconfirmed. And, yeah, again, this was created by Gianluca, I hope that's how that's pronounced, who is a Gianluca Raccani. I'm sorry for the horrible pronunciation, but he's an actual Crusader historian, so that's pretty cool that a Crusades historian actually created, some rules, and he knows what he's talking about. He's got his history down pat. He's got it correct. So thanks for watching. Probably more Crusades-related content coming out as I get my troops done. I'm still waiting on a few things before that army's created, but I should be doing some videos on how to build your forces. And, they're going to be one project in this year that is definitely going to be done by the summer. So, yeah, take care. It's a snowy day out here today. I'm just hoping it clears up before I have to drive to work tomorrow morning. And I hope you're doing well. See you on the next one.